Hey everybody, this is the 6th chapter from Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx Contra Engels. This is chapter 6 of Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx Contra Engels. I'm a little sick, so hopefully I'm not too delirious. Dialectical Naturalism as a Philosophy of History is the title of the book. The title of the chapter. Previous chapters of this book explored the principles of Marx's philosophical anthropology. In Chapter 2, Marx's view of nature was discussed with particular attention to the notion of praxis, the activity of the species as the species modified the physical world in order to produce the species' sustenance. Chapter 4 analyzed the naturalistic basis of Marx's humanism, his understanding that the state conformed to the anthropological nature of man. Marx's thought changed during his lifetime. The Marx of Das Kapital was not the same man who wrote the 1844 manuscripts. On the other hand, the young humanist philosopher of 1844 was clearly visible within the profusely scholarly pages of Capital and the Grundrisse. There was an unbroken continuity in Marx's thinking. The naturalistic foundations of his thought were always present. In his middle period, Marx was in search of revolution, and his humanism was obscured by his passionate quest for a politics of the seizure of power. In his mature period, Marx committed to paper his years of study of economics, and his naturalism was heavily overlaid with his formulas for the behavioral regularity of the capitalist system. There is only one Marx, however, even though he could assume several distinct postures. This book is not concerned with the modalities of his career, with the periods of his life. It is concerned with establishing the unity and continuity of his thought and uncovering and illuminating those ideas and presuppositions that were constant and permanently present throughout the phases of an extraordinarily productive life. The notions of praxis, of history as the autogenesis of man, of species being, of society as a totality, of relational structures, wherever present in Marx's work. This chapter will demonstrate the unity and continuity of Marx's thought by showing how the principles of his philosophical anthropology were present in his writing on political economy. It will illustrate how Marx's understanding of economics and history was erected upon the foundation of his naturalistic humanism. Social systems in the Marxian schema were always totalities. They were composites of relational structures. That is, a given society adopted a certain mode of relating to the means of production. The means of production could be privately owned, communally owned, or despotically owned. This mode of relating to the means of production was the dominant, the prevailing mode of relationship within a given societal structure and pervaded all the relational structures within that society. This did not mean that all societies were based on the same relational mode. In fact, Marx distinguished four major types of relational modes in the history of the world: the Asiatic or despotic, the Greco-Roman or polis community, the Germanic or geographical communities, the capitalistic or private property. In addition, within these four major types of relational modes, there were numerous gradations and subdivisions. For instance, the German village communities were different from the Slavic village communities, and both differed from the ancient village communities of India. Therefore, although it is possible to speak of four categories of relational modes, according to Marx, it is all important to recall the individuality and uniqueness of the societies being described. Marx believed that every society manifested behavioral regularities. Each society functioned in a particular way, and pattern of its functioning conformed to its dominant relational mode, establishing patterns of behavior which that society statistically followed. Although it is true that Marx maintained that all societies functioned in accordance with behavioral regularities, it is not true that Marx believed that all societies functioned in accordance with identical laws. Rather, different societies operated according to the different regularities unique and indigenous to it. Therefore, the developmental patterns of societies would differ. They would grow and behave uniquely and individually because the laws of society were indigenous to that society and none other. The behavioral and developmental patterns of separate societies would be separate. Marx was not a positivist. He was not a macrocosmic determinist. Marx did not believe in the existence of a universal law of development that was applicable to all societies and that compelled all societies to evolve in a uniform and unilinear fashion. The historical process was not monolinear and non-developmental, but rather multilinear and multi-developmental. Marx was a structural historicist. In his sociological and economic studies, he was concerned with change and process. Dialectical naturalism was a formula for and was most applicable when accounting for social change and process, Marx wished to describe the variety of socioeconomic formations that had come into existence within historical time. Every socioeconomic totality passed away. That was the essence of dialectical naturalism. In its place, there arose another socioeconomic totality. Marx's theory of development was not primarily concerned with temporal succession or mechanical causality. Basically, Marx's method of sociological analysis was comparative. Marx sought to examine the manner in which similar functions like circulation, consumption, wages changed their essential meaning as they were encapsulated in different economic epochs. Marx was seeking the diachronic and the synchronic. By such a comparison, Marx hoped to penetrate to the uniqueness of a historical era, its immanent relationship, its law. Marx's theory of development was not focused upon chronological order or historical inevitability, but rather upon transformation into metamorphosis. In Capital, Marx's chapter on the, quote, so-called primitive accumulation, end quote, describes the early beginnings of capitalist society in the West. Clearly, Marx understood that one historic age, period, epoch must follow another. Tribalism has succumbed to agrarian communalism, and in the modern world, the tendency was for capitalism to sublate agrarian communalism. But this does not mean that the process was either inevitable or macrocosmic. The immanent structure of different societies would respond differently to the forces of the era. For instance, in the same chapter, Marx wrote that, quote, in England alone, which we take as our example, has it the classic form, end quote. Marx meant that the process he was describing in Capital was unique to England and need not be replicated in its exact form in other parts of the globe. His awareness of differential or multilinear development was demonstrated when he compared Italian evolution in the early capitalist period to that of England. In Italy, the coming of the trade expansion of the 15th century forced the laborers of the towns back into the country to a renewed serfdom. Antithetically, the trade expansion was one of the major reasons for the destruction not only of serfdom but of the yeomen in England. Societal transformation was contingent upon the immanent structure of any given economic totality. Quote, the history of this expropriation in different countries assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different periods, end quote. Marx wished to describe the form and mode, the mode, the presuppositions of a social totality or historical epoch. The Grundrisse began with an analysis of production. He quickly indicated that production was not an unchanging eternal economic datum, but rather that, quote, all production is appropriation of nature on the part of an individual within and through a specific form of society, end quote. It was Marx's sociological and historical method to select the diachronic and synchronic within each society and then penetrate to the essential relational mode of any society. Again, in the Grundrisse, Marx wrote, quote, whenever we speak of production, then what is meant is always production of a definite stage of social development. In order to talk about production at all, we must either pursue the process of historic development through the process of historic development's different phases, or declare beforehand that we are dealing with a specific historic epoch, such as, e.g., modern bourgeois production, which is indeed our particular theme, end quote. History for Marx was then the appearance and disappearance of specific economic modes, forms, categories. The process itself had to be temporal, but his focus was never on the temporal. Rather, Marx was concerned with an analysis of the form, of the structure, of the totality, and its relational manifestations. In the Grundrisse, Marx wrote that, quote, human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape, and the intimations of higher development among the subordinate animal species, however, can be understood only after the higher development is already known, end quote. Thus, only by understanding the uniqueness of the present was it possible for us to understand the uniqueness of the past. Similar organs could be present in capitalist society as were present in classical society, but these organs would have different meanings, different functions, because they would exist as parts in different anatomical totalities. The whole colored and shaped the part. Marx assumed progressive development, but within that progressive development, he was primarily concerned with the continuity or discontinuity, the mutations of previous structures of social organisms. He was concerned with, quote, the succession of economic categories, end quote. Marx's theory of development was centered around the ideas of transformation and metamorphosis. Of course, capitalism had superseded agrarianism in the West. Because of its inherent laws, Western capitalism had a catastrophic impact on the non-Western areas of the globe. But such a belief, which Marx held, did not entail the adoption of a theory of historical necessity, of inevitable chronological order, of unilinearism. Change must come, but change for Marx came from the inherent contradiction within a social structure as that structure related to that structure's historical environment. There were internal as well as external forces of decomposition. Changes were a result of the interplay of the internal and external laws of decomposition. The important point was that both the internal structure of a society and the external historical environment were always unique, and thus the evolution of history was always multilinear and multi-developmental. Again, in the Grundrisse, Marx wrote that, quote, "The exact development of the concept of capital is necessary since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics. Just as capital itself, whose abstract reflected image is capital's concept, is the foundation of bourgeois society," end quote. The vital element for Marx was the exact concept, the immanence of a society, for it was only with this immanence that a society and that society's functioning in time could be comprehended and described. In order to best understand the structural historicist basis of Marx's socioeconomic thought, an analysis of Marx's concept of labor would be helpful. Marx divided labor into two parts. The source of all energy in the social universe was labor power. This was the hydraulic pump, the unending supply of human activity without which life could not be sustained. Labor power was the source of the generative activity of the species. Labor power was the ground from which all creative and modified praxis of the species originated. The concrete form of labor power, the form that produces objects society needed, Marx termed useful labor. It was useful labor, a specific form of labor power that was directed to produce food, tools, and all objects beneficial to men. While labor power was constant, the ground of existence, useful labor was made to assume different forms dependent upon the relational structure that directed it. In short, useful labor produced not exchange value but use value. It was use value that manifested Marx's historicism because it was the mode of useful labor that was constantly being modified as it traversed differing social totalities. Marx maintained that useful labor was, quote, a product of historical conditions, end quote. He also understood that all production, all industry was production, quote, within and through a definite form of society, end quote. Furthermore, Marx believed that there were no universal or general laws of production, but rather the, quote, so-called general conditions of all production are nothing but abstract concepts which do not go to make up any real stage in the history of production, end quote. Marx repeated this thought innumerable times. Useful labor, the creator of use value, had thus undergone several transformations in the economic social history of mankind. It was not and could never be an ontological category. For instance, during the early history of mankind, labor was carried on in its primitive natural form in a communal setting. The very nature of a communal system made labor appear as a function of the entire social organism. The labor of the individual, then, did not manifest itself in a communal environment as private labor, nor did the product of labor appear as a private product. Labor in a communal setting, there, where the individual had no existence apart from the collective, showed itself as universal labor or labor power. For these reasons, there was no production of exchange value in communal societies. Conversely, slave labor was totally different from the labor in the primitive collective. The slave was an individual but did not belong to a group. The slave, together with his labor power, was sold to his owner. The slave himself was a commodity, not the labor power of the slave. Thus, the person of the slave could be transferred from one owner to the next, and his labor power would follow him as an appendage. Nevertheless, as a private person, apart from a group, the slave could manifest his labor power as useful labor. He could produce use value and exchange value. The labor of the serf was also unique. Medieval society was characterized by an undeveloped system of exchange, and therefore personal relations of personal dependence were widespread. The serf himself was not a commodity, and only a part of the serf's useful labor was given to the lord as a tribute. No wages passed between lord and serf, and thus the useful labor of the serf could not be looked upon as a commodity. Rather, since the serf belonged to the soil and the lord owned the soil, the serf gave a part of his useful labor as tribute to the lord for his use of his land and protection. On the other hand, the position of the free laborer in a capitalist society was totally different from any of the above-mentioned modes of labor. Capitalist society perfected exchange relationships, and thus all personal ties and links of the feudal society were dissolved. The wage system was universal, and so useful labor itself became a commodity, something to be bought and sold on the marketplace like any other useful commodity. The free laborer of the capitalist society was required to auction 8, 10, or 15 hours a day to the highest bidder in order to live. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx wrote that Engels is right, therefore, in calling Adam Smith the Luther of political economy. End quote. Marx meant that before the advent of capitalism, wealth was considered as something apart from man, as a thing external to him. Capitalism had made man himself wealth, that is, the source of wealth. Consequently, if one wished to acquire wealth, one must acquire men. The hoarding of money entailed the expropriation of useful labor. The historicist basis of Marx's socioeconomic thought is additionally confirmed through a study of his definition of value. In Theories of Surplus Value, Marx took the physiocrats to task because their, quote, method of exposition is, of course, necessarily governed by their general view of the nature of value, which to them is not a definite social mode of existence of human activity, labor, but consists of material things, land, nature, and the various modifications of these material things, end quote. For Marx, value had to be, quote, a definite social mode of existence of human activity, end quote. A similar idea was expressed in the Grundrisse, where Marx referred to value as a, quote, realized relationship, end quote, or a, quote, value realized as capital and living labor as mere use value opposed to capital, end quote. In his analysis of value in Das Kapital, Marx persisted in identifying value as a social relationship. It is clear, Marx wrote in this work, quote, that the value of commodities is a purely social reality, end quote. Therefore, Marx concluded, quote, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity, end quote. Value for Marx was the realization of social relation. Value was for Marx was the realization of social relationship. It was the concretization, the objectification of a social relationship. In different societies with different modes of production, value would undergo the same kinds of societal transformation as useful labor had manifested. But this was in different societies with different modes of relationship, value would undergo the same kind of societal transformations as useful labor had manifested. But this was the exact meaning of Marx's socio-economic historicism. Value is not an eternal, abstract economic category. An object, a commodity, had value only insofar as it itself was an expression of a productive relationship. Kind of an awkward paragraph. Within capitalistic society, for example, value most concretely revealed itself as exchange value. This was the case, according to Marx, because the dominant relational mode of capitalist society was exchange for profit. Marx algebraically symbolized the essence of capitalist relationship by his formula, money, commodity, money prime, money, commodity, money augmented, or commodity, money, commodity prime, commodity, money, commodity augmented. In other words, the purpose, the intent of all productive relationships in capitalist society was profit. Therefore, any successful exchange relationship could only end with an augmentation of either money or commodities. I'll be really, really cautious about that. Profit can only be realized after the sale of commodities. Profit is only potential. This is just me talking. Profit is only potential in commodity prime, right? So, like, if the aim of a capitalist production process is to purchase means of production and labor power to produce a commodity out of those raw components that has an augmented value. But if that commodity has an augmented value and is not purchased, it has no value at all. Its value is not validated via sale on the market. So I think that it would make more sense for Levine should have just kept it at money, commodity, money prime, and not go on to this, added this commodity, money, commodity prime thing. But that's just my opinion. Back to the text. In other words, the purpose, the intent of all productive relationships in capitalist society was profit. Therefore, any successful exchange relationship could only end with an augmentation of either money or commodities. Since profit was the intent of capitalist relationship, value had to appear in capitalist society as an expression of that intent. Therefore, within the bourgeois system, value assumed the form of exchange value. There was an inherent connection between Marxist historicism and his philosophical anthropology. The Marxian view of the world was predicated upon the idea of human praxis. Man was the subject in the study of man, and society was the subject in the study of history. Man and society were the generative forces in the autogenesis of mankind. The universal source of energy in the Marxian world was human labor power. This was the ground of all existence, the essence of the source of human praxis itself, the activating principle and force in the construction of social totalities. It seems to me like Levine here is being a little cavalier with labor power and not really making it firmly drawing a distinction between labor power and labor as such, or labor power and labor, right? Labor power is the capacity to labor. The use value of labor power is actual living labor, right? But labor power is the potential to work, right? So that's kind of the basis for Marx's entire critique of political economy, is that you can purchase labor power at its value and still have an exploitative relationship, right? On the basis of equal exchange between capitalist and employee, whether his wages be high or low, that equal exchange is still the equality of the exchange between the purchase of labor power, the equality of the exchange of labor power between the capitalist and the worker is the basis for exploitation under capitalism. Right, so the value of the capitalist can put that value to work and appropriate a profit or appropriate surplus value gratis for free at the end of that production process without violating the laws of commodity production, right? Like within the confines of capitalist society, the capitalist is not stealing anything. He's perfectly within his rights as a disposer of the commodity labor power to appropriate a profit at the end of it. All right? Anyway, I'm getting away from the text, but it's just like you got to be careful with the labor power and labor distinction. Marx's economic writings can best be described as an attempt to reconstruct the dismal science on the basis of a naturalistic anthropology. Marx had made the same attempt in his early life in relation to religion and the state. Here again, the essential continuity of Marx's thought becomes apparent. In his early writings, Marx attacked religion from the basis of Feuerbachian naturalism. Religion was simply the alienation of the anthropological essence of man. In his On the Jewish Question and toward the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, Marx similarly attacked the idea of the state. The state, too, is simply the alienated anthropological essence of man. The anthropological being of man had been fragmented because of the existence of social classes, and the state was merely an invention to impose and maintain these fractures with a minimum of violence. Classical economy had deified things. Classical economy had made religious and eternal categories out of labor, exchange, and profit. The theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus were apologies for economic alienation. By treating economic categories as supernatural and unchanging fetishes, the classical economists, as bourgeois apologists, could argue that the capitalist system was justified and justifiable because it derived from these totemistic categories. Marx's economic writing must be seen not as a refutation of bourgeois capitalist economics, but as a theoretic attempt to construct a scientific and methodological sound economics from a naturalistic basis and thus to overcome economic alienation. Marx's multilinear approach to historical development was most clearly evidenced in his writing on Asiatic and Russian societies. In these portions of his literature, Marx said that not only had Oriental society in the past followed a different line of development than Western Europe, but that Russian society in the future would pursue a separate line of development from the West. In short, when Marx wrote about Asia and Russia, he did so as a multilinearist, as someone who assumed that Asia and Russia would evolve along a different path from the West and along different paths from each other. Second. During the latter half of his life, Marx became increasingly interested in the study of anthropology. A voluminous reader, Marx also took extensive notes on the material he was studying. Marx's excerpta, his notebooks, clearly document that beginning in the 1850s, Marx had become deeply involved in the study of primitive communal forms of life in their Indian, Slavic, or Germanic varieties. The initial sign that Marx was reading in Asian history appears in the notebooks of 1853. He read 8 books on Indian history and society during that year, including such works as J.F. Royal's essay on the productive resources of India, an inquiry into the causes of the long-continued stationary condition of India, Thomas St. Raffles, The History of Java, Robert Patton's The Principles of Asiatic Monarchies. Furthermore, there were 11 titles on Russian history for the same year. Marx's acquaintance with the anthropological work of J.L. von Maurer began in 1868. He read in that year Maurer's Einleitung zur Geschichte der Markhof, Dorf und Stadtverfassung. In 1876, he returned to von Maurer again, reading at this time Geschichte der Markenverfassung, Geschichte der Fraunhofer, and the Geschichte der Dorfverfassung in Deutschland. Ancient Slavic institutions also preoccupied Marx during the years of 1876 and 1878. He read M. Utizinovich's Die Hauskommunen der Südslawen in 1876 and completed Haxthausen's Die Landliche Verfassung Russlands in 1878. Marx continued his study of ancient institutions in 1881 and 1882. Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, J.W.B. Money's Java, How to Manage a Colony, V. Fears, The Aryan Village in India and Ceylon, and H.J.S. Maine's Lectures on the Early History of Institutions were all read in 1881. J. Lubbock's The Origin of Civilization and the Primitive Condition of Man, a chronologische Aufzeichnungen über die Aufhebung die Leibeigenschaft in Russland. D. M. Wallace's Russia were finished 1 year later. The above list is not exhaustive. It does show that in the latter half of his life, Marx was seriously studying the unique and indigenous social structures of German, Slavic, and Indian communal existence. Having studied the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe, Marx was now familiarizing himself with the dominant relational modes of ancient village societies. Initially a student of capitalism, the fundamental contrast between Occident and Orient was apparent to Marx. Marx saw the world divided between a young, dynamic European economy based on private property and a primitive Asiatic society based on village communalism. Marx's excerpta on anthropology show that there existed in Marx's mind an outline, a tentative structure for a comparative study of the destruction of communal life and its supersession by a different form of society. Marx was studying how one layer of human history had been destroyed by a new layer of human history, that is, how societies with different social structures based on communal property were replaced by societies with different structures based on private property. Marx concluded, then, that Occidental civilization had taken a different path of development from Oriental civilization. At the end of 1880, Marx read H.J.S. Maine's Lectures on the Early History of Institutions. The major thrust of H.J.S. Maine's book was to trace the different forms of landed proprietorship that evolved in Europe, Brittany, England, and Ireland. While dealing basically with Western Europe, Maine could not help but be aware that other races, Oriental, had pursued a path of development different from the Germanic. Marx copied the following from Maine's monograph, quote, "Modern research conveys a stronger impression than ever of the separation between the Aryan races and races of other stocks," end quote. For Maine, the breakdown of tribal communalism stemmed from two factors. One, the disentanglement of individual rights from the collective rights of the tribe. Two, the, quote, transmutation of sovereignty of the tribal chief, end quote. It was evident to Maine that the feudal decentralization of Western Europe was a stark contrast to the hydraulic despotism of the Orient, which proved that different historical evolutions had led to a, quote, separation between the Aryan races and races of other stocks, end quote. Marx found in Maine's research confirmation of his own belief that Asia and Europe had pursued separate paths of development. Drink here. Earlier writings of Marx show conclusively that from the 1850s, Marx was dedicated to the multilinear view of history. In the Critique of Political Economy, Marx affirmed a multilinear view of historical development, for Marx argued that, quote, "From the different forms of primitive communism, different forms of its dissolution have been developed," end quote. In Marx's eyes, when tracing the history of ancient communal societies, one should begin with the, quote, "various forms of Indian communism," end quote. India then was the great mother, the original source of all later communal forms of life. From this common base, various lines of historical evolution had emerged, specifically the type of private property known as Roman and Teuton can be traced back to various forms of Indian communism, end quote. Marx therefore affirmed two complementary theses. One, within the spectrum of communal societies generally, different communal societies had evolved along different lines. Two, Marx agreed with H.J.S. Maine that Western and Eastern societies had broken off into separate lines of evolution. Marx's conviction that communal societies could assume unique shapes and acquire histories was more definitely expressed in his Grundrisse. It was in Grundrisse, written during the years of 1857 to 1859, that Marx incorporated much of his research on primitive societies. The first form of communal society described in the Grundrisse was the Asiatic form. In this socioeconomic totality, the Oriental despot was the sole proprietor of the land. Although the elemental component of the Asiatic form of society was the isolated village, in fact, the village was both powerless and propertyless because the land belonged to the despot who formed therein an all-embracing unity. The specific manner in which the Asiatic despot exercised his social control, as well as the Asiatic despot's social usefulness, was through the Asiatic despot's maintenance of public works. Village communities in arid regions needed water to carry on those village communities' agriculture, and the Asiatic lord had as the Asiatic lord's primary social duty the construction and preservation of irrigation canals. Consequently, the local community was absorbed in the encompassing unity of the peasant commune. Marx was quick to point out that the Oriental social organism could develop along distinctly different lines. First, Asiatic societies, in order to defray the cost of the community as such, for war, for religious worship, could make a certain amount of labor communal property. Where this line of development was taken, serfdom emerged. The domination of an aristocracy evolved from this path. as shown in the ancient Slavonic and Romanian communities. Secondly, Asiatic societies could turn all labor into communal labor. Where this line of development was taken, absolute state capitalism emerged. In other words, the despot became the sole proprietor of all labor and therefore of all value, and thus became the universal capitalist. This line of development had been taken in Mexico, in Peru, and among the ancient Celts. Sorry, I'm looking at this. To call these societies state capitalism is fucking weird and incorrect. The second form of communal society described in the Grundrisse was the Greco-Roman. In this form, the basis of the community was not the land, but the political unity of the city. A precondition for ownership of land was membership in the polis. The political bond was primary. The great common labor of the city commune was war. Therefore, the polis community was expansive. Private property could more readily evolve from the Greco-Roman form than from the Asiatic. In the Asiatic form, property belonged first to the community, but ultimately to the despot. In the Greco-Roman form, private property was not inconsistent with membership in the polis community. Because the political bond was primary, a member of the polis community could contribute to the common labor through service in war or religious worship, and not in the least abrogate the politico-communal basis of the city-state because of private possession of land. Marx's inference was obvious here. The development of a capitalist system in the West had definite historical antecedents. That is, the existence of economic private property in the classical world introduced into Western history not only the toleration of, but the tendency toward a complete system of private ownership. This was not true of the Orient. The absorption of property into the local community was the despot distinctly blocked any movement to private ownership. The third form of ancient communal life, according to Marx, was the Germanic. Greco-Roman history was the history of cities. Asian history was the history of small villages, while in the Middle Ages, German history was the history of the countryside. Because of the nature of settlement during the invasion, because of the long distances that separated one tribe from another, the German community was less a natural political or economic union than a voluntary association based upon tribal descent, language, common past, and history. In the German form, if the community was to exercise a real existence, it must hold an assembly, seek, in short, a tangible form. In Greece, Rome, and India, the community existed apart from such assemblies in the common territory of the city or village itself. In the Germanic form, as distinct from the Greco-Roman, the economic took precedence over the political. The Germanic knew no private property. Property belonged to the tribal community. The individual is merely a possessor, really an agent of the community in the cultivation of the land. This discussion of Marx's writing on anthropology and ancient societies can be summarized on two different levels, as method and as content. Methodologically, Marx was looking for the forms, the total structures of ancient and communal societies. Marx distinguished among Greco-Roman, German, capitalist, and Asian societies in terms of their dominant relational modes. Marx's method of scientific procedure, the manner in which he conceptualized data, reveals that he was not seeking unilinear laws of historical growth. The empirical procedure under which Marx chose to operate was calculated to depict the uniqueness of societies, the difference between societies, and their different paths of historical evolution. From the point of view of content, Marx had demonstrated three cases in which societies had developed along separate paths of development. 1. Asia and Western Europe had developed differently. 2. Within the Oriental form, communal societies could either develop in a Slavo-Romanian aristocratic fashion or else in a Peruvian-Mexican state capitalist fashion. 3. Because of the unique structure of the Greco-Roman forms, private property already existed in these economies. Since, in the classical work, community was defined in political terms, thus allowing for private property economically, the Greco-Roman polis community would develop differently from either Asian or Germanic forms. Thus, both in terms of method and in terms of specific content, Marx denied that all societies are compelled by some universal law to develop along uniform and fixed lines. He was not a universal determinist. Beginning in the 1870s, Marx was forced to deal with the problem of the future historical development of Russia, the emancipation of the serfs, the rise of a bureaucratic spirit among the Russian intelligentsia. The rise of a revolutionary spirit among the Russian intelligentsia made the question of the possibility of a communist revolution in Russia an immediate possibility. Or made it an immediate question, In dealing with the problem of Russian development, Marx displayed the same attitude, the same method and content of thought that he exercised when dealing with ancient communal societies. Marx stressed 2 points. 1, that the laws and predictions of Das Kapital were intended to be descriptive only of Western capitalist society. Marx did not intend Das Kapital to be a universal deterministic scheme of historical development. Clearly that's not what Capital is about at all. Capital is not a history book. Das Kapital, therefore, was not necessarily applicable to Russia. 2, the Russian society could evolve in a manner totally different from the West. The Russian Mir was a social unit which could act as the force to drive Russian society as a whole in a unique communal direction. In 1877, Marx wrote a letter to the editor of the Russian journal Alt Yesestevenia Zabisky, indicating that Das Kapital only tried to trace the path along which one area of the globe, Western Europe, had evolved. Any attempt, Marx said, to make his, quote, historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophic theory of the Marche Generale, or I guess Marche Generale, general path, imposed by fate upon every people, whatever the historic circumstances in which it finds itself, end quote, was an error. In the preface to the second German edition of Das Kapital, Marx alluded to a Russian review of his book, with which he agreed, that paralleled Marx's evolutionary history to the domain of biology. Unlike earlier economists, the reviewer stated, Marx had not compared his economic theories to the laws of physics and chemistry. Rather, Marx had demonstrated, quote, that social organisms differ from one another as fundamentally as do vegetable and animal organisms, end quote. Indeed, the same event is subject to quite different conditions in terms of the unique organism in which it is found. The internal constitution of economic organisms differ, as well as their individual organs, because these organs function under a wide variety of conditions. In the correspondence that Marx had with Ferenc Szűcs, he reiterated his conviction that Das Kapital only analyzed, and therefore was only applicable to Western Europe. On the 8th of March 1881, Marx wrote to Szűcs, quote, at the bottom of the capitalist is, therefore, the radical separation of the producer from the means of production, ... The basis of this whole evolution is the expropriation of the peasants, ... It has been accomplished in a final form only in England, ... But all the other countries of Western Europe are going through the same movement. The, quote, historical necessity, end quote, of this movement is thus explicitly restricted to the countries of Western Europe, ... End quote. In the same letter, Marx commented on the utter futility of any attempt to find universally deterministic laws of social evolution. Marx said, quote, by studying each one of these evolutions separately, the key to these phenomena can easily be found, but one will never succeed with the open sesame of an historic philosophical theory of which the supreme virtue consists in its being superhistorical, i.e. beyond the pole of history, end quote. Marx. It was in his writings on the Mir that Marx most clearly expressed his view that Russia could evolve in a manner totally different from the West. Marx addressed himself to the question of the Mir when Ferenc Szűcs wrote to him asking whether or not the Mir might act as a transition point to communism. Szűcs wanted to know whether in order to attain a communist society, Russia must pass through capitalism, imitate the Western path of development, Menshevism, or whether it was possible for Russia to skip capitalism and build communism upon the communal nature of the Mir. In replying to Szűcs, Marx wrote 3 drafts of the letter. These drafts to Szűcs will be discussed under 3 separate questions. Could Russian society develop along a different path from Western Europe? Could the Russian Mir act in itself as a transition point to communism? What was Marx's opinion about the idea of historical inevitability? In the past, Russian development and Western development had differed. Western Europe had gone through, quote, a long period of incubation, end quote. before reaching the industrial capitalism of the 19th century. Europe had first to develop steamships, railroads, machine technology, as well as banks, institutions of credit, and the entire mechanism of exchange. It had taken Europe centuries to develop the technological and institutional basis for the type of capitalism that existed in the 19th century. Russia had not undergone any similar development. Thus, when trying to speculate on the future course of Russian history, one must take into account that the past history of Russia and Europe differed, and that in terms of the 19th century, these two areas of the globe began with entirely different social structures. It was true that the ancient communal village had been destroyed in India and Western Europe, but this was no reason to conclude that the communal village was also inevitably doomed in Russia as well. The Russian situation differed from both the Indian and European examples. In India, the communal village was destroyed under the pressure of British imperialism, but Russia was an independent country. No foreign power, because of military supremacy, had unilaterally intervened into Russia's domestic affairs to wantonly eradicate a native social system. The Russian village community and the Western German village community shared a common historical lineage. They were both offshoots of the archaic Indian type, but there the similarity ended. The Germanic village community and the Russian village community both were had experienced radically different histories. Even though vestiges of the Germanic community still lingered, basically it had been destroyed during the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The Germanic conquest of Roman territory had laid the foundations for feudalism. As new land was taken, a Germanic aristocracy was formed. The village community still existed, but alongside it there had developed private property and land in the possession of new Germanic nobility. Also, the Germanic community, like the Russian, was composed of families, i.e. kinship relations were primary. Given the existence of a private property feudality, gradually the German community began to dissolve as each family acquired private possession for itself. Thus, the historical environment in which the German community was placed accentuated the forces of dissolution. That is, the political and social forces surrounding the German community were such as to extinguish its community basis and to replace it with a private property basis. Nothing like this had happened to the Russian mir. Enjoying a different history, the mir had survived until the 19th century, which testified both to the mir's strength and to the mir's uniqueness. Even though it faced enormous difficulties, there was no inherent reason, according to Marx, for the mir to be dissolved. The village community appeared in Western Europe because its economic development was blocked and cut short by the development of capitalism. Village communalism and capitalism had been contradictory forces in Western Europe. In 19th century Russia, on the other hand, Marx felt that capitalism and the mir could complement each other. Peasant property sharing continued to be an accepted part of Russian society. The mir need not be destroyed by industrialism, but rather could incorporate and utilize in the mir's own interest the advances of industrialism. For instance, the world market created by industrialism had opened up new markets for agricultural products, and thus the mir could find new outlets for the mir's products. In addition, recent technological advances in agriculture, like plows and fertilizing equipment of all kinds, could be incorporated in the mir's structure and increase the output of the mir. Thus, the progress brought by capitalism and industrialism during the 19th century need not impede or obstruct the survival of the mir. There existed the possibility, even if small, that capitalism and industrialism could create the conditions in terms of markets and increased productivity that would sustain and enhance the very existence of the mir. The political situation favored the survival of the mir. The workers' movement in Europe and America was anti-capitalist. The masses of both continents were seeking alternatives to the private property system. The mir was clearly one such alternative. From the political standpoint of the dissenting masses, the preservation of the mir was something to be desired. The socialist revolution would overthrow capitalism, but it would be self-defeating to overthrow any form of already existing agrarian capitalism. Because of the different histories of Russia and the West, if the Russian countryside were to be capitalized, this development would be accomplished in a vastly different fashion from that of the West. In Europe, private property was already in existence under feudalism. This form of private property was landed property. In Europe, under capitalism, private property was extended to the industrial and commercial means of production. The line of development for the Occident, thus, went from one form of private property to another form of private property. The line of development for Russia, if it were to be completely capitalized, would have to be totally different, according to Marx. In the countryside, communalism existed. Thus, Russia would have to move from communalism to private property. This was not only a different path of development from the West, but was a process that would require a different set of circumstances and factors than had operated in the West. The three drafts of Marx's letter to Ferris Asulich clearly document two sets of conclusions at which he had arrived. The past history of Russia and the West had been different. The conditions within Russian society were such that the future development of Russia and Europe could remain different, i.e. the mir could survive and act as the basis of a collective society generally. Excuse me. Someone told me, it's like, you should edit out the drinking and like the pausing and the things where you flip between pages. And you know what? They could eat my poop. I don't even know what the last thing I read is. I have COVID right now, so I'm kind of delirious. I don't even remember where I'm at, but hopefully I'm not missing anything. Concerning the question of whether the mir in itself could act as a transition point to communism, Marx saw in the mir certain elements which were superior to other industrial forms that were completely dominated by the capitalist system. Even in the form in which it existed in the mid-19th century, the collective nature of the mir made it a more desirable social form than capitalism. It was not necessary for either Russia or the mir to pass through capitalism. It was possible for the mir to incorporate, quote, all the positive accomplishments that have been created by the capitalist system without having to pass through all the horrors of that system, end quote. In short, all the productive capacities of the modern industrial system could be grafted onto the collective social structure of the mir. Modern machinery could be immediately owned communally. Marx believed that it would be an avoidable misfortune for Russia to pass through capitalism. To do so would be to throw away one of the best historical opportunities to bypass the horrors of the system. There existed a chance that the mir could regenerate Russian society. The mir could be the, quote, direct point of transition to that economic system toward which modern society tends. It could open a new way of life without beginning with its own self-destruction, end quote, Marx. In other words, it was possible to build a socialist society without passing through capitalism on the collective foundation of the mir. In order for Russia to make this transition, it was necessary for Russia to have a political revolution. Marx believed that the policies of the Tsar favored the strengthening of capitalism and therefore the destruction of the mir. Consequently, if the mir were to survive, the Tsar must be overthrown. However, if a Russian revolution were to succeed, it was necessary for the revolution in Russia to be supported by a revolution in Western Europe. On this point, Marx wrote, quote, if the Russian Revolution sounds the signal for a proletarian revolt in the West, the decomposition of the communal ownership of land in Russia can be evaded, so that each complements the other. The prevailing form of communal ownership of land in Russia may form a starting point for a communist course of development, end quote, Marx. Marx's strategy for a successful communist revolution in Russia had the following ingredients: the political seizure of power in Russia by those who wished to build socialism, a proletarian revolution in Western Europe, which would prevent a capitalist Western Europe from intervening in Russia and destroying the revolution there, with the mir preserved. The use of the collectivist nature of the mir as an immediate foundation for the building of a communal society. Concerning the question of historical inevitability, in the letters to Ferris Asulich, Marx specifically rejected the possibility of historical determinism. When discussing the collapse of the communal village in Western Europe, Marx posed himself the rhetorical question, whether the Russian mir must also be destroyed. In his first draft of Ferris Asulich, Marx answered the question in the following way, quote, does that mean that under all conditions, the development of the peasant commune must take the same path? Not by any means, end quote. In the third draft to Asulich, Marx repeated the same idea, quote, but does that mean that the historical course of the peasant community must inevitably lead to the same result? Not by any means, end quote. In the second draft of the letter, Marx addressed himself to a slightly different self-imposed question. Marx asked what were the real forces that menaced the mir, and answered that what threatened the mir, quote, was neither historic inevitability nor theory, end quote. The idea that it was not necessary to pass through capitalism to arrive at communism that there were no indispensable stages of historical evolution, and that the development of different societies could vary, was not expressed by Marx for the first time in his writings on Russia. The earliest indication of such beliefs are found in Marx's Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law. In that essay, written in 1843, Marx clearly pointed out how Germany's development had differed from French and English development. Marx also believed that it was possible to have a communist revolution in Germany. In fact, Marx maintained that the only real revolution that was possible in Germany was a radical proletarian communist revolution. Thus, Germany need not pass through capitalism before starting to build socialism. Furthermore, the proletarian revolution in Germany was the counterpart of the liberal bourgeois revolution in France. And so the development of France and Germany would continue to differ. Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law was the first statement of Marx's belief, which was to remain unchanged throughout his life, that it was possible to move directly from a basically feudal society to communism by a one-stage revolutionary process. Marx's writing on the mirror not only demonstrates his multilinear approach to history, but also clarifies the methodology of dialectical naturalism. When Marx analyzed the society, Marx concentrated upon the social relationships of that society. He tried to isolate the dominant relational mode of that society. Societal meaning, value, was an expression of that dominant relational mode. Marx was not primarily concerned with materiality, with thingness. Economics for Marx did not mean the study of objects, of instruments, of tools and money. What made a society unique were not the material objects that helped compose it, but rather the social relations that were its essential structure. Dialectical naturalism postulated that society was determined by basic material need to reproduce life, but that in the reproduction of life, the creation of human sustenance, social relationships, not material objectivity, were the dominant force. Dialectical naturalism was a tool of social analysis rather than a predictive device. Dialectical naturalism allowed Marx to see in the dualism the inherent contradictions of the mirror so that he could better understand the options and possibilities of the mirror's development. He could not absolutely predict the history of the mirror. He could, however, see its potentials. Marx looked upon the mirror as a unique social structure. It was a totality, but at the same time, the mirror was composed of contradictory elements. The dominant relational mode was communal. However, there existed in the mirror the potential to move in the direction of private property. The mirror, like any other social structure according to Marx, was a totality superimposed upon the conflict of form and content. The dominant relational mode of the Russian peasant commune was collective. Land belonged to the clans and was worked cooperatively by the kinship groups. Its form, therefore, was cooperative. However, because land belonged to families, it was possible for the totality of the mirror to dissolve and fragment into kinship groups who held property. Its content, consequently, was potentially bourgeois. Like any other social structure, Marx maintained, the mirror was a totality that incorporated mutual contradictory elements. In the case of the mirror, the decision whether it was to remain communal or dissolve into private property would be made by the external forces surrounding this structure, the political and social environment in which the mirror found itself. The forces in operation around the mirror would reinforce either the communal potential of or the private property potential, and therefore determine the developmental option of the mirror. For instance, if there were no Russian Revolution and the Tsar remained on the throne, he would support the development of capitalism in Russia. Capitalism would be the dominant force surrounding the mirror. Therefore, the potential inside the mirror for private property would be made dominant, and the mirror would be destroyed. Or, if there were a Russian Revolution, if the Tsar were overthrown and socialists came to power, they would preserve any collectivist entity. Communalism would be the dominant force surrounding the mirror. The potential inside the mirror for cooperative ownership would be made dominant and the mirror would survive. Marx looked upon societies as total social structures that contained inherent oppositions. Marx was concerned with social mutations, fissions, mutual contradiction. Dialectical naturalism was intended as an analytic tool to measure the oppositional tensions within a total social structure. The internal contradiction of form and content. Marx was not concerned with historical inevitability. Dialectical naturalism was not meant to be a macrocosmic law of unilinear social development. Furthermore, dialectical naturalism was not meant to be eschatological. Communism was not equivalent to the kingdom of God, to the salvation of man after his fall into original sin, i.e. capitalism. The proletariat was not a secular version of the Messiah who came to redeem man from his fallen state, nor was communist society a paradisiacal, Paradisiacal state, paradisiacal paradisiacal state, one in which pain, suffering, mutability were entirely absent. Communism entailed the abolition of the state of social classes. With the destruction of state and social classes, a new epoch of human history would begin, the conquest of human freedom. But Marx was not an impossibilist. He did not believe it possible to have a human condition without pain, without individual suffering, without historical process and individual mutability. He did believe it possible to create a society that was anthropocentric, that is, a society fully coincided with man's natural being. Such a condition was eudaimonistic, but that was not the same as a total absence of morality. The end. That's the end of the chapter. I'm going to read the footnotes. I'm just going to read the things that were cited. Alfred Schmidt, Der Begriff der Natur in der Lehre von Marx. It's 1962. There's an English translation of that. It says, for an excellent introduction of the question of the totality in the work of Marx, see Theodor Adorno and Jürgen Habermas, Der Positivismusstreit in der deutschen Soziologie. I guess that's the positivist debate. Marx, preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. Marx Grundrisse says, there were and are many commentators who have attacked the positivist interpretation of Marx as an economic determinist or a unilinearist. Antonio Gramsci, Karl Korsch, Georg Lukács in the 1920s pioneered the attempt to reinterpret Marx and overcome vulgar determinism. Karl Korsch, Marxismus und Philosophie, Marxism and Philosophy, 1966, and Georg Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, did not, however, see Marx as a historicist. It was Antonio Gramsci, selections from the prison notebooks, edited and translated by Quentin Hoare and Jeffrey Noel Smith, who pointed to and examined the historist inclinations of Marx's thought. Quentin Hoare was an important editor at You Left Review. Claude Levi-Strauss, Structural Anthropology, and Emmanuel Touré, Marxism in, quote, Primitive Societies, end quote, translated by Mary Koppler, Monthly Review Press. Marx Das Kapital, translated by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling. Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital. Marx, Private Property and Labor, and Karl Marx, The Early Writings, translated by Tom Baltimore. In the 20th century, Georg Lukács, Karl Korsch, Antonio Gramsci, and Louis Althusser have debated the problem of historicism in Marx. All begin on the assumption that Marx was not an economic determinist, that he was not a positivist. In his book, History and Class Consciousness, Lukács used the term, quote, vulgar Marxism, end quote, to refer to all those who interpreted historical materialism as a universal law applicable to the development of all societies. Lukács was one of the first to protest the philosophical and historical rigidities of Stalinist orthodoxy. But Lukács did not think Marx a historicist. Lukács recognized that all socioeconomic systems were historical phenomenon, that they changed in time. Nevertheless, Lukács' major concern was the fusion of theoretical Marxism to the proletarian class struggle. Therefore, Lukács believed that the major concern of historical materialism was the criticism of capitalist society. Lukács also believed that historical materialism should be used by the proletariat to strengthen its own self-knowledge, to enhance its own potential as a revolutionary force. Consequently, even though Lukács understood the historical nature of the economic process in Marx's thought, the direction of Lukács' comments was aimed at making historical materialism a politically efficacious theory in the revolutionary class struggle of the 1920s, rather than at viewing historical materialism as a philosophy of history. Karl Korsch, a German contemporary of Lukács, joined Lukács in rejecting the absurdities of Stalinist mechanistic materialism. In his book, Karl Marx, published in 1963, Korsch used the phrase, quote, historical specification, end quote, in trying to describe Marx's dialectical naturalism. Korsch, by using this phrase, tried to indicate that Marx believed each socioeconomic society was specific to its age. That is, each society was a specific and unique historical product with behavioral regularities peculiar to it, but in no way subsumed under a universal law. For Korsch, the liberation of historical materialism from its positivistic distortion had immediate political implications as well. Where am I? Because it meant that the proletariat was to undogmatically adjust its tactics to conform to the political realities of a given historical period. Korsch, however, never used the term, quote, historicism, end quote, to refer to Marx, and seemed more concerned, like Lukács, with immediately combating both capitalism and Stalinism, than with making statements about Marx's philosophy of history. Sorry, that's disgusting, but I'm sick. Forgive me. Gramsci's prison notebooks did directly refer to Marxism as historicism. For Gramsci, Marxism was above all a philosophy of praxis. Marxism was primarily about human activity. Since human activity was constant, the changes it would introduce into socioeconomic formation were constant. When Gramsci referred to Marxism as historicism, he meant that it embodied a, quote, realist immanence, end quote, i.e. the generative force of history existed in history itself as man. Most recently, the French communist Louis Althusser has attacked Lukács, Korsch, and particularly, of course, Gramsci. Althusser's On Reading Capital. I don't have that full book on the channel, but I do have Louis Althusser's essay from that, which is called, I believe, the Object of Capital. I also have Louis Althusser's introduction to the book as a whole. But, yeah, it's on the channel, so check it out. Anyway, most recently, the French communist Louis Althusser has attacked Lukács, Korsch, and particularly, of course, Gramsci. Althusser's On Reading Capital from 1970 adamantly maintained that, quote, Marxism is not a historicism, end quote. This does not mean that Althusser was returning to the positivism and the absolutist materialism of the Stalinist era. He has much too incisive a mind to fall into that confinement. Althusser wanted to defend the truth claim of Marxism. He wanted to show that Marx had indeed penetrated to the essence of the capitalistic system. Distinguishing between epistemology and the philosophy of history, Althusser wished to validate the epistemological correctness of Marxism. Aware that socioeconomic structures and their laws change in time, Althusser believed it possible to grasp the essential concept of each socioeconomic formation to grasp its truth. In other words, Althusser did not want a historicist philosophy of history to co-opt epistemology. Althusser did not want this to state that because societies change in time, truth changes in time. He wanted to say that although it was granted that societies change in time, it was also granted that the human mind had the ability to grasp the essential concept of every society, to discover its truth, and that this truth would not change. Whereas Gramsci saw historical materialism arising from a philosophy of praxis, Althusser saw historical materialism as a methodological tool of social analysis. Lukács and Korsch saw historical materialism in its relation to the political warfare of the laboring classes. Leaving aside the epistemological question, the center of gravity of this present chapter is upon Marxism as a philosophy of history. Within this context, there can be little doubt that Marx was a structural historicist. This means that Marx opposed any imputation of eternal categories in human history. There were no laws in general, only regularities unique to each social totality. There were no ideas in general, only ideas unique to each social totality. There were no production relations in general, only relations of production indigenous to each social organism. Since human praxis was at the center of Marx's philosophy of man, so process was at the center of his philosophy of history. Social totalities had changed in the past. There had been four: ancient, classical, feudal, and bourgeois. The system was open-ended, and transformations would continue to occur in the future. And then another footnote says, the thesis that Marx is a unilinearist was essentially a product of Engels, Kautsky, and Stalin. Because of the political and ideological need to make Soviet Russia appear as the vanguard of the world communist revolution, Soviet scholars interpreted Marx as an economic determinist. They interpreted dialectical materialism as a sociological formula, as a cosmically valid pattern of development of all societies which require that they move through three necessary stages: feudalism, capitalism, and communism. If this three-stage pattern were true, and since Soviet Russia was already building toward communism, then it logically followed that Stalinist Russia was leading the world revolution. Economic determinism was not only a perversion of Marx, but served as a political platform. It not only justified the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, not only made the Soviet Union the leader of Marxist revolutions, but also strengthened Stalin's personal position inside the Kremlin because it could be used to substantiate his policies. As we have seen, several scholars of Central and Western Europe rebelled against the rigidities and absurdities of Stalinist orthodoxy. Opposed to Stalinism as a political system, they were also opposed to Stalinism in its theoretical forms. Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci who almost simultaneously rediscovered the notion of praxis in Marx, were also unanimous in rejecting the Stalinist interpretation of Marx's economic determinism. They referred to Stalinism as, quote, vulgar Marxism, end quote, and maintained that it was an utter distortion of Marx's theory to see it as a macrocosmic law of historical development. The debate concerning Marx and determinism continues to the present day. Many scholars maintain an essentially Stalinist picture of Marx, without, of course, the political intent and purposes of Stalinism. John Plomnitz, in his book German Marxism and Russian Communism of 1965, not only referred to Marx as a, quote, economic determinist, end quote, but also found that Marx, quote, invented a law which he believed must apply to the whole of history, end quote. There was no discussion in the Plomnitz's book concerning the idea of praxis in Marx. Furthermore, Plomnitz failed to take into account the manuscripts of 1844 or the Grundrisse. Zbigniew A. Jordan, or Z.A. Jordan is what I always call him because I don't know how to pronounce his name, in his penetrating book, The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, basically defended the thesis that Marx ended his life as a social determinist. I have a piece by Z.A. Jordan on the origins of dialectical materialism on this channel. It's from Marx and Myth or some shit like that. It's like a page on Marxist.org that has a bunch of theses that kind of like debunking certain like presuppositions of Marx's critics or Marx's false interpreters of Stalinism. So it has like false Stalinist interpreters. So it has like pieces by like Maximilien Rubel, it has pieces by Hal Draper, Cyril Smith, and so on. I think it might even have a piece by John Holloway. I'm not sure. Where am I? In discussing Marx's philosophy of history, Jordan insightfully distinguished between two periods of Marxist thought. During Marx's early period, Jordan concludes that Marx thought of dialectical naturalism as a method of social analysis rather than a metaphysical assumption regarding the cause of history. However, Jordan affirmed that in the second period of his career, Marx conceived of dialectical naturalism as a, quote, metaphysical theory as well, end quote, and that in its second formulation, the materialist conception of history had been, quote, transformed from a hypothesis concerning the genesis of social and historical events to a theory of historical causations, supposed to be based upon a study of historical causes and historical effects. End quote. In The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1963, Karl Popper not only misinterpreted the word, quote, historicism, end quote, but also distorted Marx. In Popper's eyes, Marx was a social, quote, prophet, to be classed with Plato and Hegel. Within the pages of Popper's book, Marxism was defined as, quote, sociological determinism, end quote, whose sole aim was to predict, quote, the future course of economic and power political developments, and especially of revolution, end quote. A similar note was struck by Isaiah Berlin, particularly in his book Historical Inevitability, published in 1954, the title of which describes in essence Berlin's own reading of Marx. Those who still defend the view of Marx as a positivist can be classified as the contemporary apologists of, quote, vulgar Marxism, end quote. The growing literature that rejects the interpretation of Marx as a universal... What the fuck? Sorry, there's some strange bug. It kind of looked like a little toad or something like that. I don't fucking know. Just fell in my book. A growing literature that rejects the interpretation of Marx as a universal determinist has been forthcoming within the past 2 decades, basically from European scholars. Two notable exceptions to this rule, however, are Karl Wittfogel and Irving M. Zeitlin. In Oriental Despotism, Wittfogel discussed for perhaps the first time Marx's concept of Asiatic society. Wittfogel showed that Marx held Oriental society to be unique, to be distinct from Western capitalist society, and to possess its own pattern of development. Wittfogel concluded that Marx did not believe in a necessary 3-stage development for all societies, from feudalism to communism. In a small book, Marxism, a Re-Examination, which has not received the attention it deserves, Zeitlin interpreted dialectical naturalism as a method of social analysis. Zeitlin correctly maintained that it was possible for dialectical naturalism as a method of analysis to be correct and yet not commit itself to statements about the metaphysical nature of history. Dialectical naturalism was an analytical tool, not a predictive device. On the European side, it is not a distortion to say that all intellectual leaders of French Marxism have categorically rejected the positive positivist view of Marx. See Henri Lefebvre, Dialectical Materialism, translated by John Sturrock in 1968. Lefebvre, The Sociology of Marx, translated by Norbert Gutterman, 1968. Lucien Goldman, The Human Sciences and Philosophy, 1968. August Cornu, The Origins of Marxian Thought, 1957. Jean-Paul Sartre, Critique de la Raison Dialectique, and that's Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 1960. For a fuller analysis of Cornu's interpretation of Marx, see Karl Marx et Friedrich Engels, 3 volumes. The 2 books by Louis Althusser are important in this respect. We've already mentioned On Reading Capital. See also For Marx, translated by Ben Brewster. All these writers credit Marx with a multilinear view of history. For West Germany, where the tradition of Kors still lives, see Schmidt, Der Begriff der Natur in der Lehre von Marx, and Schmidt, Beiträge zur marxistischen Erkenntnisidee, 1969. Irving Fetcher, but it's Irving Fetcher, Karl Marx and Der Marxismus, which is going to be on this channel. I have that book finished, and the recordings of it are up, but I've delayed their release, so if I release them all one at a time, people might listen to, the first one and then never listen to the other ones. If I stagger them, people are more inclined to listen to them. Irving Fetcher, Karl Marx und der Marxismus, from 1967, and works from the Frankfurt School of Marxism. The 2 outstanding figures of the Frankfurt School of Marxism are Theodor Adorno and Jürgen Habermas. The views of both these men are contained in the anthology Der Positivismusstreit in der deutschen Soziologie. See also Horkheimer, Critical Theory, translated by Matthew J. O'Connell in 1972. A few of the most meritorious articles on Marx to be found in the pages of Marxismusstudien or Ludwig Landgraber, Das Problem der Dialektik, and Landgraber, Hegel und Marx, 1954. Erwin Metzger, Mensch und Geschichte im ursprünglichen Ansatz des Marx-Interpretation. I don't know how to say that in German. I don't know what the date is for that. These authors are in basic agreement with the French, upholding dialectical materialism as a methodology and again placing human praxis in the center of Marxist thought. Another footnote says, the entire corpus of Marx's notebooks is in the archives of the International Institute for Social Research in Amsterdam. I'm not sure if that's the same thing, but there's an International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, which might be what it's called now, or what it was called then. I don't know. It has a lot of it's where all the some of the most important documents from the history of the left are preserved. The author would like to acknowledge the generous support of the American Philosophical Society, which allowed him in the summer of 1791 to read all of Marx's anthropological excerpta. HJS Main, Lectures on the Early History of Institutions. Marx and Engels, The Russian Menace to Europe, edited by Paul W. Blackstock and Bert F. Hoselitz, published in 1952. Marx's letter on the Russian village community in Marx and Engels, The Russian Menace to Europe. Marx towards a critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. See my article, Humanism Without Eschatology, in the Journal of the History of Ideas, published 1972. For a view that Marxism is eschatological, see among others Martin Buber, Paths in Utopia, and Robert Tucker, Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx, published 1964. The end. Thanks for listening. Yeah. You have COVID? Damn.